afternoon, everybody. I'm Keith Christiansen. I'm Chairman of the Department of European Paintings. It's my great pleasure to welcome you here this afternoon. And we'll try and get you out so that those of you who are Jets fans can get back to the really important issues of the day. But for us, this is a very important day. The collection of Velázquez at the Met, I think some of you may be aware, is the most extensive in America. And we're really fortunate in New York, because if you think of the three great pictures up at the Hispanic Society, and then the marvelous portrait of Philip IV at the Frick, only outside of Spain, only London can offer its public a similar outstanding group of works by this most outstanding of painters. Now, by my count, there are possibly 10 paintings by Velázquez in New York. And when I say possibly 10, it's because a number of pictures at the Metropolitan continue to be, the attributions of them continue to be disputed. And as all of you know, this last summer, the cleaning of one of those pictures that had long been assigned to the workshop of Velázquez revealed a totally autographed work. And although I don't expect this experience to be repeated at any time soon, I will refer to another picture. This afternoon you're going to hear first from me, then from Michael Gallagher, who is our brilliant head of paintings conservation, and from Jonathan Brown, who has spent a lifetime studying Spanish painting. He is the outstanding scholar of Spanish painting and who has written the most authoritative book on Velázquez. And I think I want to take this opportunity right now to thank Jonathan for his kind collaboration with us as we have proceeded in the study of our works by Velázquez. It's been an absolute pleasure to work with Jonathan, and really the lecture series today is his lecture that we're building up to. What I want to do very quickly is to trace the formation of the collection at the Metropolitan, because in an encapsulated way it tells the story of the rising esteem for Velázquez in the 19th and 20th centuries, and the efforts that were made at the Metropolitan to make sure that this great artist was represented in the museum. It may come as something of a surprise to many of you, but Velázquez was not well known in Europe in the 17th and 18th centuries. Having worked so closely with the court of Philip IV, his reputation was largely confined to Spain. Murillo was far more famous in Europe in the 18th century, and it was Murillo who was considered the greatest of Spain's golden age. It was with the triumph of realism and impressionism in the 19th century that Velázquez came to displace Murillo in the pantheon of artists. By the 20th century, Velázquez, of course, has become viewed not simply as the greatest Spanish painter before Goya, but one of the greatest painters who ever lived. And I think there are those who would say quite simply that he was the greatest magician of paint in the history of Western art. When, in 1970, the Metropolitan Museum purchased the portrait of Velázquez's mulatto slave, Juan de Pareja, for a record-setting price, it was felt that it had secured a unique masterpiece, the crown of the collection. I don't know how many of you remember the subway advertisements encouraging people to come and see the most expensive painting in the world, a place that had previously been held by Rembrandt's Aristotle contemplating the bust of Homer. But it was, I thought then, a very audacious move, and it's a long time since this museum has demonstrated that sort of braggadocio. And yet today, $5.5 million sounds like nothing when compared to what is spent by private collectors at any sale of 19th and 20th century. And of course, one of the real outcomes of what we could call the demographics of the economy following deregulation has been that museums are no longer the principal buyers of great works of art. Private collectors are, and we're increasingly dependent on the philanthropic interests of collectors to augment our collection, which is why I suppose that this is the time for me to say that we are very happy to solicit checks from any of you in the audience. You just send them to the European Paintings Department, and the little notation part at the bottom you say for acquisitions, and I guarantee they will be well spent. As I think all of you know, this picture of Juan de Pareja was painted in Rome in 1650, where it was exhibited to great acclaim. Velasquez manages to convey not only the physical presence of the sitter, but his proud character. Juan de Pareja, of course, became a painter in his own right. He was freed by Velasquez in 1654. The Act of Liberation was actually signed in Rome in November of 1650, 9 months after the picture was displayed, but Juan de Pareja was required to remain another 4 years with his master. The picture stayed in Italy until 1776, when it was acquired by Sir William Hamilton, and between 1814 and 1970, it belonged to the Earls of Radnor. I don't think that there's any doubt that this is one of the icons of the museum, and I don't think anybody begrudges the amount of money that was spent on it at the time. It quickly displaced the previously purchased Velázquez, an equestrian portrait of Count Duke Olivares, Philip IV's powerful minister, that was bought from the Earl of Elgin. The first notice of this impressive picture is 1806, and I hope you're getting the parameters. It's early 19th century is usually about the earliest we can trace these pictures to. It's a reduced variant of a large painting in the Prado, and when it was acquired, the museum was convinced it was purchasing a major work by the artists. However, the other day, in looking through the files, I noted with increased interest that some of our more critically minded visitors did not share the opinion of the curators. And of course, one of the objects of the exhibition upstairs is to encourage critical viewing. So I just want to mention that shortly after it was purchased and put on view, one visitor wrote a letter that is in our files in which, and I quote, he expressed my amazement and indignation at the remarkable attribution of a fourth-rate copy to the hand of Velasquez. There was a discussion whether the letter should be, whether a reply should be made to this letter, and it was finally decided it was safer just to let the matter die. I think that the letter is an exaggeration, but the matter of Velázquez's personal involvement in this picture remains unresolved, by which I mean there's no real consensus among scholars. And this is due to the fact that we still know too little about the workshop of Velasquez and the capabilities of those in it, and what sort of function a reduced replica like this. It's actually not a replica. There are variants. The landscape is completely original. The horse is white, not brown, etc. What kind of prestige would have attached to it? Velázquez's son-in-law, Juan Bautista del Mazo, became a gifted painter in his own right, and he must have been a principal assistant in the workshop. But can he be credited with having painted this picture, which, as I say, is not a reduced replica, a reduced copy, but a variant? At this stage, one can only advance an opinion, but one deprived of the kinds of evidence one would like to have. Interestingly, Mazo has also been proposed as the author of this picture, and this is the first painting associated with Velasquez to enter this museum. It formed part of the gift made in 1889 by Henry Marquand, railroad magnate, philanthropist, and a president of the Metropolitan. You might also remember that he gave us our first Vermeer. The picture can be traced back to 1813, when it was acquired in Spain, and it was considered a self-portrait by Velasquez when it entered the museum. But already in the early 20th century, this attribution and identification were dropped. The recent suggestion that it could be a self-portrait of Mazo seems to me really highly speculative. It's far too early to move in this direction. A quarter of a century later, the museum was bequeathed two very important paintings by Benjamin Altman, whose gift of works of art transformed the museum's collection overnight to one of international status. The greatest of these two is the Supper at Emmaus on the left, a work painted in Seville prior to Velázquez's move to Madrid in 1623. But the second one is scarcely less interesting. It's a portrait of Philip IV, painted in 1624, the year after Velázquez arrived in Madrid and was appointed official painter to the king. Both of these pictures have a checkered attributional history, and both are in less than optimal condition. But the Supper at Emmaus is now pretty universally accepted, while the final verdict has yet to be delivered on the portrait. In fact, the picture is currently the subject of study. It is not on view in the galleries upstairs because it is undergoing a thorough restoration under the hands of Michael Gallagher. Last week, Michael Gallagher, Walter Littke, who's writing a catalog on the Spanish paintings, and myself made a trip to Madrid to study comparative material. When the picture was sold to Benjamin Altman by descendants of the family for whom it was painted, it was accompanied by a receipt signed by Velasquez himself, and this is in the museum's collection. The papers run through the mechanism of payment to Velasquez, and I've transcribed over here this line here. You'll see Diego Velázquez, Carta de pago de 800 reales de Diego Velázquez, and there's his signature at the end. He received 800 reales for 3 pictures: Philip IV, the minister Olivares, and one of himself. The man who commissioned the picture, Don Garcia Perez de Arciel, was closely associated with the court and accompanied the king to Seville in February of 1624. He must have commissioned the picture immediately after the trip. However, he died that September, and the portrait, together with the one of Olivares and the portrait of Don Garcia, was paid by his wife. His wife, incidentally, when she remarried, was depicted again by Velasquez. The museum's picture is based on an official portrait done for the king, but that work no longer survives, and ours is the earliest portrait of Philip IV for which documents exist. For years, Velasquez scholars have remarked to me that the status of the picture can only be properly determined after it's properly cleaned, but we knew it was badly compromised, and the cleaning of it posed real problems. However, following the very happy result of the portrait we're discussing today, we decided to take the radical step of cleaning the work. The results have been illuminating. They bear on a whole series of issues relating to Velasquez and our understanding of his workshop practice, and I hope that at another point we will be able to have a discussion similar to this one about that picture. This brings us to the 2 remaining pictures that we now ascribe without hesitation to Velasquez: the recently cleaned portrait of a man and the bust-length portrait of Maria Teresa, the daughter of the king. Both of these were bequeathed to the museum by Jules Bache. In a sense, Bache is the hero of the story we have to tell today, and I'd just like to do a short review of his life. Born in Germany, he came to the U.S. as a young boy. In 1881, he began work as a cashier at a stock brokerage firm owned by his uncle. Within 5 years, he was a minority partner, and in 1892, he took control of the business. He renamed it the J.S. Bache & Company, and it became one of the top firms in the U.S., outranked only by Merrill Lynch. He obviously had a feeling for painting, and he collected old masters with an admirably Catholic taste. Not for him the preserve of a single school or type of painting. Here's his house at 814 Fifth Avenue, the interior of which was filled with works of art. So important is Bache to the collection of the Metropolitan Museum that I want to pause for a minute to consider some of its highlights, since among them are some that I'm sure you would count among your favorites in the museum. Here's a selection of some of his Italian paintings. I think many of you will recognize Filippo Lippi's Madonna and Child, Filippino Lippi's Madonna and Child painted for the Strozzi family in Florence, Signorelli's Madonna and Child, retained by Signorelli and given to his nephew on the occasion of a marriage, Crivelli's divine little Madonna and Child, Cosimo Turra's Flight into Egypt, and what is possibly the museum's finest Titian, the Venus and Adonis. It was scarcely less fine when it came to early Netherlandish. It included Petrus Christus's marvelous Carthusian monk, the Gerard David triptych of the Nativity, Holbein's portrait of Derek Boek, 2 wonderful portraits by Frans Hals, and Rembrandt's Standard Bearer. 2 of the most glorious of the museum's Van Dycks, his self-portrait and his portrait of Robert Rich, the 2nd Earl of Warwick, and the 2 Velasquez's and Goya's Don Manuel Osorio. When I say that this museum is deeply indebted to the philanthropy of collectors, private collectors in this city. It is no exaggeration, and Jules Bates is one of our greatest donors. I thought some of you would be interested to see the interior of the house as published in the Herald Tribune in 1937. Here was the entrance hall. As we run around, there was the Filipino Lippi, the Signorelli, and I think that they're all registered in the caption below. Another view of the interior of the hallway, with additionally Ghirlandaio's portrait of Francesco Sassetti and his son, the Goya, and a Giacometto Veneziano portrait on the other side. Here's the sitting room with the Garrett David triptych hanging above a couch. Next, what Bates called his Dutch room, and well he might. The Rembrandt is now considered a workshop piece, but there's the Frans Hals, there's the Second Earl of Warwick by Van Dyck, and here's the little Velasquez Maria Teresa, another view of the same room with the Rembrandt standard bearer, the Van Dyck self-portrait, and the other Frans Hals. And then here's the French room with Fragonard, Watteau, the French comedians. At one point, Bates thought of establishing his house as a museum on the model of the Frick. He opened the lower floor to visitors on application several days a week, but by the time he died in 1944, he had scuttled this idea. Instead, he left his collection of paintings to a foundation with the understanding that the whole collection would go to the Metropolitan Museum. It was reported in the Herald Tribune that Bates had reasoned as follows, and I quote, "After mature consideration of the future, I felt I'd like to know where the collection would be 100 years from now. After keeping a private museum for several years, I realized there's no great future for a small private museum. I felt that the collection should be made more convenient to a growing public." All I can say is I wish there were more collectors like this. Of course, Bates took care of his daughters financially, but he obviously felt that the collection was an aspect of his life he wanted to memorialize and perpetuate. And we've all been the beneficiaries. We can get an additional sense, a real insight into his very strong self-image in his wonderful but hardly modest mausoleum, which he built in Riverdale as an Egyptian temple. In 1949, the Bates collection officially entered the Metropolitan Museum. So, what about the portrait of the man that is today's subject? Here's what we know about it. Sometime before circa 1800, it was acquired as the work of Anthony van Dyck by Johann Ludwig Rijksgraaf van Waldmolen-Gimborn. He was the illegitimate son of George II of Great Britain and of his mistress, Amalie van Waldmolen, who was created for the occasion Countess of Yarmouth. Raised at the court of St. James, Johann Ludwig made the grand tour in 1765 and then settled in Hanover, where he built a castle to house the collection of antiquities he had amassed. Was it during this time, possibly, that he had found the Velasquez and purchased it without understanding who it was by? In 1818, his son, Ludwig Georg Tedel, a distinguished general in the Austrian cavalry, sold the picture to David Bernhard Haussmann. And it was in that collection that, in 1854, a British collector connoisseur, Sir Hugh Hume Campbell, saw the work and first identified it as a painting by Velasquez. In 1857, it was sold to George V, King of Hanover, Duke of Brunswick-Lüneburg, Duke of Cumberland. He was the last king of Hanover and a member of the German branch of the House of Hanover and, not surprising, first cousin to Queen Victoria. He inherited the Hanoverian realm and put his collection on view in the Hanover Museum. It was there that a leading Velasquez scholar, August Mayer, came upon the picture in the early 20th century. It hung among the paintings ascribed to the Circle of Rembrandt, but in 1917, Mayer published it as a self-portrait by Velasquez. Here's a photo showing the way it looked at the time. Not long after, Mayer revised his first opinion, suggesting instead the name of Velasquez's pupil and future son-in-law, Juan Bautista del Mazo. So you can see already that one is juggling with uncertainties and the parameters that can be drawn around Velázquez himself. It was, however, an unfortunate change of mind, and it had been prompted, we later discover, by a discussion with a Spanish colleague whose ideas Mayer had not fully understood. In 1925, the picture was sold to a German art dealer, Leo Blumenreich, and it is at this stage that Joseph Duveen, one of the legendary figures of the art market, enters the story. He wanted to purchase the picture from Blumenreich and to sell it to one of his clients. But he realized that his plans would be spoiled unless Mayer could be convinced to abandon the attribution to Mazo. But he also knew that if Blumenreich knew that Mayer had changed his mind and ascribed the picture to Velázquez, then he would not be able to purchase the picture for next to nothing and sell it for a huge profit. You can see the bind he's in. Mayer proved a tough customer. He wanted to be fair to Blumenreich, and he didn't like the idea of changing his mind yet again, most of all of being forced to change his mind through the lure of money. He thought it would ruin his reputation. Duveen used every inducement imaginable, and in November of 1925, he finally wore Mayer down. Mayer caved in, came to Paris to view the painting, which Duveen very cleverly had, according to a cable that we have in our files, had the picture cleaned up a little, as I think it would give a much clearer effect for a discussion with Mayer. He was right, and on November 20th, the cable was sent to New York, triumphantly announcing to Duveen, Mayer passes Velázquez. I think it would be naive not to be somewhat cynical about Mayer's change of mind, given the financial stakes involved. He, of course, was paid for his trouble and pressed to write an article. But the recent recleaning of the painting suggests the degree to which the picture Mayer studied that November really did look utterly different from what he had previously known, justifying his exclamation that seeing the clean picture was one of the most delightful surprises which I have ever had in my life. Now, I do want to mention that in these comparative photographs, the image of it before cleaning actually makes the picture look better than it did in the galleries. And those of you who remember the picture in the galleries will recognize this immediately because having been taken with powerful photographic lamps, they are actually penetrating the varnish in the way that your own eyes did not. Mayer went on to say, oh wow, how did we end up with this? That's the view of Delft through Vermeer. That's interesting. Sorry, there we are. Whoa. Let me see if I can get rid of this. This must be Walter's lecture. There we are. How about that? That's for tomorrow night. There we are. The modeling is simply marvelous, wrote Mayer. The painting is like a flowing watercolor. The tints of the face look like mother of pearl. It has come out most splendidly. The picture lost all the dimness and shows now the characteristic silver-gray tone of the works of these years. Mayer wrote these lines to the director of the Detroit Institute of Arts, who was also the editor of the Journal of Art in America, in which Mayer would publish his views in 1926. What a shame, then, that instead of leaving the picture in this state, it was, through extensive retouching, transformed into a more formal, finished portrait, such as might appeal to Duveen's stable of clients, among whom was, of course, Jules Bache, who purchased it shortly thereafter for $225,000. Obfuscated behind repaints and a thick, much yellowed varnish, by 1955 the picture little resembled the work that Mayer had admired in the restorer's studio. The attribution of the picture to Velázquez was questioned by a major Spanish scholar who found the picture lacking the artist's rich subtlety and frankness of execution. In 1963, José López Rey, the great Velázquez scholar, cataloged the picture as a school piece rather close to Velázquez's banner, which was not that far off considering the altered appearance of the picture. And after this, the work gradually dropped out of consideration. In 1979, the museum decided the time had come to downgrade the attribution of to the workshop of Velázquez. Well, I've always been intrigued by this picture, which whenever possible, I hung in the gallery. So when last spring Michael Gallagher was working on the great portrait of Philip IV at the Frick, I asked that the picture be brought up for a better look. And it's at this point that I'd like to turn the story over to Michael Gallagher.
Right, here we go. Good afternoon. When I first came to the museum in October 2005, not long thereafter, Keith and myself walked through the galleries and we discussed paintings, and in particular paintings that might benefit eventually from being examined or looked at more closely in conservation. And along the way, we looked at this portrait, and Keith said at the time it's a picture that had always intrigued him. He talked about its connection or possible connection with the Surrender of Breda, and we agreed that it was interesting. And a lot of people since the exhibition have said to me, sort of, what took you so long? And when we did a press view together a few months ago now, I said at the time, if I'd known that the transformation would be so great, I would have done it in the first week. Great paintings make you look better as a conservator, but it isn't always clear that a picture will benefit from conservation. This is the image of the painting before treatment. I think once your eye has been primed by seeing it in the galleries, you see many of the qualities. But believe me, when it was on the wall, that was not clear. I would often go through the galleries, and I would, over the course of the years, intervening years, and look at it just in passing for a minute or so. And the fortunes of the picture in my mind went up and down, and the whole concept of whether it would be a wise thing to do also changed. This is a detail before treatment of the costume, and I think it really gives some idea of how dead the whole thing looked. I think you can see there's some drip marks in the varnish. There is a sort of a dullness all across here that wasn't so evident whether that was just a product of the varnish. And people sometimes think that any picture, when it's cleaned, will be better, will look better, fresher. And that isn't always the case. A bad picture can sometimes have a sort of mystique under a discolored varnish, that once you remove that, you just simply end up with a bad picture. And nobody particularly wants to be the means of apparatus for unveiling a bad picture. Similarly, a painting that it was once a good picture but has been severely damaged, perhaps by harsh cleaning in the past, abrasion and other problems. Ethically, if we uncover something like that, there is only so much we can do in terms of restoration. So again, what would be the benefit? The picture told a story as it was in the galleries, and perhaps all that would happen was it would be immediately relegated to the store, never to be looked at again. However, there was something very compelling about the portrait. And again, this is before treatment, enormously magnified, and as Keith said before, with strong photography lights. But the work quality is evident, and that was what always kept me curious about the picture. And so, as Keith has said, this last spring and summer, when the Frick's picture was here, it seemed a very good idea to bring the picture up for examination. Interestingly, we had a couple of the other paintings up that are in the little display upstairs. And, for example, the portrait of the man that Keith showed earlier, I'm sorry I don't have a slide of it, evidently that didn't need cleaning. It was a very handsome, pleasing portrait, but there was no question in our mind that this was a work by Velasquez. Another portrait that we have that we haven't even put on display is so possibly overpainted, but again, no sort of burning desire to sort of go into any sort of treatment. However, this picture was something quite different. When it came up, I opted to do, after careful examination in the great light we have in the studio, I opted to do a cleaning test along this part here. And the change was very radical. I knew we had fairly scant documentation, but I knew it had been treated a number of times whilst it had been here in the Met's collection. Each time it hadn't actually been cleaned, the varnish layers hadn't been removed, simply more varnish had been put on top. And when Devine had this restored, as Keith said, when Meyer saw it, he described something that is very much like the clean state photo. What happened subsequently was that the picture was tidied up to turn into a sort of more finished portrait and all master. So in this before treatment, which is, if you imagine, this is the 1920s restoration that has become darker over the years. The varnishes have got darker. The toning used to quieten the slightly lively brushwork in the background has darkened. And one of the key areas you'll see in a moment in the after cleaning where there are problems is in the hair, where the artist made quite dramatic changes that subsequently were worn in a previous cleaning and so on. And a very artificial and rather rigid contour had been applied to the head. And the toning, again, of the freely painted areas in the drapery had sort of really become so foggy that you didn't see any modeling at all. The radical change Keith and I discussed, we suddenly saw these sort of deep, rich blacks, this sort of more silvery sense of the greys. But there was still a question whether how abraded the picture was. And if you imagine when you're looking in a small area, you can't always assume that is how the whole picture is going to be. You can't always read into to that small test sufficient information to get a different reading of the picture as a whole. But it was significantly intriguing that in the end I decided to proceed with the cleaning. Clean state paintings are always a little disconcerting, I think, if you're not used to seeing them. For one thing, we take the photography at a midway stage when varnish and overpaints have been removed, but before the painting is properly saturated with the varnish. So I always describe varnish, if you think of a pebble at the beach that you wet out, and the richness of tone and color that emerges, that is what a varnish does with an old master painting. That is why they were varnished. And so the saturation is less in here, so you don't get the full range of tones in the doublet. You don't get the full depth of tone in the hair. But what became immediately clear, and I mean about 2.5 hours after I'd started the cleaning, I called Keith. He came over immediately, and we were both very, very excited by what we were seeing. And it very quickly became clear that this was not a highly finished portrait, but it was much more of a life study that was never taken to a full level of completion. It wasn't as if it was unfinished in the sense of the artist was interrupted, but its purpose was not as a sort of fully commissioned portrait. The retouching, obviously, there was a couple of little holes here that had to be, these were filled, one down here at the edge. And then the retouching pretty much was in this area here and very carefully under magnification where I could see where the strokes had been interrupted by being rubbed. I could put in a few little dots of color. But the main change you'll see when I change slide is one of saturation. And you get this really extraordinarily fresh, dynamic portrait, really. The picture's constructed on a sort of pinkish grey ground. That's the paint layer that was put over the entire canvas surface prior to painting. You see it showing through a little here and here. And when you see the paintings in the galleries, you'll sense the role that sort of warm underlayer has through the whole picture. Velasquez would have laid out the features and the position of the body using a sort of a brush, blackish brown paint with a brush. Here is a little cancelled line. It may be the position of upraised arm, it may be something else. But if you imagine that the whole of this picture was probably sketched in, all of the features, the position, with this sort of line, and then from there, he would have developed the volumes with quite a thin applications, veils of a sort of blackish brown paint. It's painted with startling authority, great rapidity in many places. The wonderful collar here, which would have been really painted in a matter of seconds. You can sense the movement of the brush when you go upstairs and see it. You have these, dashing little, about 3 or 4 dashing little strokes of the white that immediately orientate the collar, give you a sense of its consistency. And the doublet as a whole is very summary in its treatment. You get a sense of the volume of the shoulder, you get a sense of some of the tailoring details, but it is not taken to a high level of finish. The concentration, the focus is all on the head, and which is really just I think a miraculous bit of painting. And this thin brown I was talking about, blackish brown, you can sense how the picture might have looked at one point when it was all in a sort of monochrome state being worked up. I found from working on the Frick picture, working on this picture, it is possible to try and break up the painting technique into steps, but it's very artificial. We can make generalizations. I mean, he is using the thinner blackish brown tones, leaving some ground visible, leaving some of this monochrome underlayer visible, and then building up with more opaque but quite liquid color, creating these sort of pearly effects where they're put very thinly over the dark underlayer, and then getting more more thickly painted to create these this wonderful rosy hue here in the cheek, the sort of liquid highlights over the brow, over the nose, and so forth. And then, obviously the mustache is added a little later, this fantastic sort of line just shooting up here, this very sort of perky mustache. But the reason I say it's a generalization is because what is so extraordinary about him as an artist is he doesn't, or it's in a sense a fool's errand to try and break this down into a 10-step painting technique. There are periods in art that you can do that. There were workshop techniques at different periods where literally you painted that layer, you waited till dry, you did that, you did this. I think anyone can tell looking at this that there is this extraordinary intuition and intelligence and sensitivity in recording visual data, this hand-eye connection that is simply dazzling. So though it's easy to say that a stroke like the highlight here or here is put on at the end of the process, it really tells you nothing about what an extraordinary picture this is. Here is the before and after in the face. I think when you look back, you can see the qualities, but I also think this marvelous sense of almost slightly moist skin, the way the light glances off the skin stretched over the bone structure, the wonderful texture of hair, the softness of the lips, the slight move in focus were really not evident before and have been one of the great aspects of the recovery. So we are in the museum extremely excited to have this picture, and it's a painting that, of course, when you go up and look at it in isolation, it really stands on its own merits. It's It's a picture that you can very much enjoy without knowledge. But the wonderful thing about works of art is that often when they're put into a greater context, the context of the artist's life and period, they resonate all the more. And that is why Professor Jonathan Brown's collaboration with Keith and I was so important and stimulating, and really why we wanted to do this talk today, because it's that expertise that really will bring this picture to life. Thank you.
Thank you very much. It's always a pleasure to talk about Velasquez, and I have been known to go on for hours. However, given the restraints of time, patience of the audience, and I guess above all the Jets game, I will be as brief as I can possibly be. But let me begin. You saw briefly Vermeer's view of Delft. You may wonder what in God's name it's doing in this context. And a former colleague of mine, known to many of you, Robert Rosenblum, was a great specialist in, indeed, a great friend. And he was a specialist in outrageous comparisons. And I'm only sorry he didn't live to see this one. In any event, why would I think of putting these two together? Well, there is no intrinsic reason, but it so happens that some years ago, a London magazine took a poll of British artists, art historians, and art critics as to which was the greatest painting in the history of Western Europe. And the winner was the painting on the left, Las Meninas by Velasquez, his masterpiece. And in second place was the view of Delft. Now, as a matter of fact, you may say, well, what do they possibly have in common? And that, I can assure you, is a subject for another day's conversation. But I think, on the one hand, it's the kind of almost the deadpan and yet very suggestive approach to landscape taken by Vermeer, and with Velasquez, of course, the enigma of what's going on and the really dynamic tension of and daring of leaving such a leading question entirely open to interpretation. Now, as I say, that's not what I'm talking about today, and the only reason I brought Vermeer into play is that he is renowned as one of the least productive painters of all time. And he lived from 1632 to 1675, a lifespan of 43 years, an active career of 22 years, and if you do a crude calculation, it turns out that he painted about a picture and a half a year during his active career. So definitely a withholding genius. But Velasquez is a close second. He was born in 1599, he died in 1660, a lifespan of 61 years, an active career of 43 years, an output of roughly 110 to 115 paintings, and translated into a crude average, it's 2.7 paintings per year. Now, it's clear that this is a kind of, if you like, a race to the bottom as to who painted less, but the mitigating factor is that Vermeer was a private painter, so to speak, whereas Velasquez was a court painter. He had been brought to the court of Philip IV in 1623, and his job really was to make, essential job was to make portraits of the king and members of the royal family. And if we think of a contemporary of his, famous contemporary, Anthony van Dyck, who fulfilled a similar role at the court of Charles I in the early 1630s, and the pictures are counted by the dozens. But Velasquez painted but very few pictures. Now, as you'll see momentarily, Keith and I did not coordinate our presentations in any way, which will lead to the following section, which repeats what he had to say. Pictures by Velasquez in New York, and this is the Supper at Emmaus, which is hanging in the gallery. Our old friend Juan de Pareja. I do want to point something out in this portrait. This is clearly one of the great portraits that Velasquez ever created. Velasquez's genius as a painter is the extraordinary economy with which he achieves magnificent effects. Now, next time you go up into the gallery to look at this portrait, I want you to notice two things in particular. I want you to notice the definition of his ear. When you move up close to the painting, all you see is a rather undefined area of red paint. In other words, what you're looking at is a blob. But the eye reads it as an ear, no problem, because Velasquez realizes that when you focus your view on any one thing, what you see along the periphery of that view loses some of its definition. Take another look at this hand. When you go up into the galleries and look at this hand, you will say, my God, that's a claw, that's not a hand. And you can see it even here. But then again, he knew that this commanding presence, the pose, the facial expression, were the secondary, primary elements in the picture, and that he could get away, so to speak, with doing just almost a kind of notional representation of the other parts of the body. This is Maria Teresa. Here, this is probably a workshop model, and wonderful, these kind of butterfly hair adornments that she uses. This little bolt of lightning is actually a plume, a white plume that was worn in fashion. And then you see how he leads the eye around. Here's the butterfly, fully defined. Now it begins to be simplified, simplified, simplified. Turns the corner. And again, we're looking at blobs, but the eye's been conditioned to look, to make the transition from this to this without thinking about the enormous pictorial distance that has been covered. Keith also mentioned this portrait of Philip IV, now under study, and the portrait of the Conde Duque de Olivares, and I have to confess that I have been one of the doubters. But then again, I doubted the portrait that's just been rediscovered, so there's always room for error. In fact, the more time you spend studying something, the more room for error you seem to find. Now we look, there are, as Keith mentioned, a total of 8 paintings by Velasquez in New York. That's for the New York collections, which amounts to 7% of his total output. And now we've moved uptown to Broadway and 155th Street, to the Hispanic Society of America, where we see Velasquez's great patron, the Count Duke of Olivares, one of the first portraits that he does after his appointment in 1623 at the court. Here's a small, charming, very unusual work in Velasquez's production of a little girl, and has, as the portrait in the Met, and you can see it very clearly, only the head and face are fully defined, and then it drops off into the realm of kind of a sketch. And then as a companion to Juan de Pareja, portrait of Cardinal Astali, painted in the same year as Juan de Pareja, 1650, and a great, great masterpiece by Velasquez. And then finally we conclude our Velasquez tour of New York by going to the Frick, and this undoubtedly is the great masterpiece among the works by Velasquez in New York collections, the portrait of the king, Velasquez's patron Philip IV, painted in 1644, a picture that was in Michael Gallagher's studio at the same time as the head by Velasquez, and I must say, proved with this picture very well known, featured in all of the literature on the Frick collection. But with the removal of the slightly discolored varnish, it just came to life in ways that were absolutely stunning. We know that the picture was painted in 3 days, which is a record for Velasquez. And it was painted in difficult conditions just off the battlefield. But the Frick is publishing a complete study of the restoration of this work. Now, unfinished works are by no means unusual in Velasquez's oeuvre. I'm going to show you just a few of them. This is a portrait of a young man in Munich, a work of the early 1620s, and here you can see just the outline. This was characteristic of Velasquez's working method of outlining the composition with these strokes of black. So the hand, you can't really make it out, but his hand is resting on his hip. That's his hand. And then here he's meant to be holding his sword. And even though it looks like the pommel of the sword, and even though it doesn't look like much at all, once I tell you what it is, you can see exactly what he means to represent. This is a portrait in Dresden of the master of the royal hunt, Juan Mateos. And here, this is, again, you can see that the hands have not been brought to finish. This is actually, what he's doing here is holding on to the handle of a pistol. This is you can't make it out too clearly in this, but this is a belt from which he has a pistol suspended, and then this hand isn't finished. So move on to the picture I showed you a moment ago of a young woman sewing. Oh, I'm sorry. We don't want to watch it. Wait. This is a portrait of a famous Spanish sculptor, Juan Martínez Montañez, and here he is working on a bust of Philip IV. You can see the telltale upturned mustachio, which was all the fashion at the court at the time. But while the portrait of the sculptor is finished, you can see this part here has just been left in outline. This is in the National Gallery of Art in Washington. It shows a young woman sewing, very unusual subject for the artist. And you can see once again that the head and the hair are finished, but the hands, and she's obviously working on some embroidery, are just given the most briefest description. Here's a sketch of the second wife, second consort of Philip IV, Mariana de Austria, in the Meadows Museum, this elaborate wig that she wears. And then, again, the face is highly finished, but the costume is really just begun and left unfinished. This was probably intended to be used, again, as a workshop model. And then this is a portrait of Philip IV in the National Gallery of Art. It was painted, again, to be used in the workshop. It's the one painting I wish he hadn't painted, because everybody who sees it says, oh, he looks just like you. But there you are. And again, the head is fully developed, and then the costume is just sketched in. And then there is yet a later modello for the workshop, which is in the National Gallery in London. So portraits are not unusual. Unfinished portraits are not unusual. Nevertheless, the painting which has just been reattributed to Velasquez is unusual in one respect. It is a preparatory study for one of Velasquez's masterpieces, the Surrender of Breda. Let me give you a little bit of background information on the commission for the Surrender of Breda. It was intended to be the principal gallery in a pleasure palace that Philip IV built on the outskirts of Madrid during the 1630s. This is a plan you can see. It was built around an old Gothic church, the Church of San Jeronimo, and it consisted of these courtyards where different events were taking place. They were looking at it from a slightly different angle, but this is the palace with its two plazas, and then the elaborate gardens that were planted. Just to orient you, if you're familiar with Madrid today, this church of San Jeronimo still exists. But all of this section here is occupied by the Prado Museum. Now, in this principal gallery, so-called Hall of Realms, which is just here, and here, the Conde Duque de Olivares commissioned a cycle of paintings commemorating the great military victories of Philip IV. And this was known as the Hall of Realms. And this is a virtual, the Hall of Realms was decorated with a series of 12 military victories won by the armies of Philip IV. This is the king, you can barely make him out, Philip IV. This is his consort, Isabel de Bourbon. The battle scenes are seen here between the windows, and then above are the labors of Hercules painted by the renowned Spanish Golden Age painter Francisco de Zurbarán. And this was the intended place for the installation of Velázquez's painting of the Surrender of Breda. This is the Surrender of Breda, which you see here. Let me just briefly describe to you what is going on. The siege itself took place as one of the major battles of the 30 Years' War, which went from 1618 to 1648. And Breda was a Dutch fortress which gave access to the Netherlands and was a very key strategic site. In 1624, the Spanish army, under the command of General Ambrogio Spinola, a Genoese who was one of Philip IV's general, laid siege to the town of Breda, which you see here in the background. And eventually, the Spanish army was able to starve out the garrison, and the city capitulated. As the soldiers withdrew, you can see here, this is Velázquez's rendition of the surrender scene. You'll see in a moment that it actually looked very different than what you see here. But here is the defeated Protestant general, Justin of Nassau, who is offering the keys to the city as a sign of surrender to the Spanish general Spinola, Ambrogio Spinola. But Spinola, instead of accepting the keys, laid a conciliatory hand on the shoulder of Justin of Nassau. In other words, he is showing his respect for the military prowess and bravery and courage of his valiant Dutch opponents. Here on the left then are the Dutch troops, and they're showing standards, pikes with orange flags, orange banners. This was a symbol of the House of Orange, Nassau, the Dutch troops. And over here on the right is a contingent of the victorious Spanish army, featuring the famous motif of these lances or pikes, which are shooting up into the sky, fence-like, a kind of symbolism of the invincibility of Spanish arms. Now, the victory, as I say, was a famous one, and it was broadcast all over Europe. In 1626, a Flemish Jesuit, Herman Hugo, wrote an extensive description of the siege, which lasted for several months and was visited, in fact, by the governor of the Netherlands, Isabella Clara Eugenia, the aunt of Philip IV. This is her banner, just here. This checkered flag has nothing to do with NASCAR. It is the symbol of the colors of the Infanta. And then you see here in a kind of cluster of heads who are the Spanish generals who assisted the Ambrogio Spinola in the military maneuvers that led to the Spanish victory. Now, in fact, we know in the first place that Velázquez's approach to a surrender scene was extremely unusual. This is another of the pictures in the Hall of Realms by a young contemporary of Velázquez. It shows the same general, Ambrogio Spinola, and here an identifiable face of the Marqués de Leganés, a high-ranking Spanish nobleman. And in this case, as you can see, the surrender scene is a scene in which the defeated, this is another battle, the Battle of Jülich, in which the defeated general kneels down in obeisance. He is vanquished, and his pose shows that he is indeed a loser. Now here's how the Surrender of Breda actually looked. One of the commemorative acts that was taken was the commission of a gigantic engraving by the famous French printmaker Jacques Callot, and he follows literally what happened. Standing on a horse, sitting on a horse, here come the Dutch troops that are marching by in good order. One of the terms of the surrender was the fact that Dutch would be allowed to withdraw, not in hasty retreat, but could march out from the citadel with their colors flying. Velázquez's version, of course, is entirely made up. What happened here is not what truly happened there. And it's part of his conception of the surrender scene, which, to those who are versed in the history, make it so unusual. And he emphasizes the unusual quality by showing the hindquarters of a horse prominently displayed. And for a very long time, no one was able to figure out why literally the horse's ass should be given such a prominent place in this picture. I'm happy to say that it was figured out by myself and my collaborator, Sir John Eliot, that the significance is that of the horse is that Spinel is not sitting on it. In other words, in honor of his opponent, he has dismounted. And then the little scene that unfolds is painted. Now, the Spanish troops are here, and there's this cluster of heads. This is John of Nassau. This is the Marquis de Besançon. This is Spanish General Carlos Coloma. They were all known, their appearances were all known through prints and paintings of portraits which had been executed. You'll notice, though, and of course, none of the soldiers wear uniforms. Uniforms, in fact, neither uniforms nor standing armies really came into existence until the end of the 17th century, and soldiers wore whatever clothes they had. But we know, obviously, this is the Spanish side, this is the Dutch side. But standing over here is a Dutch soldier with his rifle on his arm. He looks out, and over here is a Spanish soldier. You can actually, if you follow down, these are the high boots that were characteristic of the Spanish dress. The Dutch wore floppy boots. The historians of military uniforms have made all of these distinctions clear. And then you notice just through the opening here in the foreground, you see the Dutch troops that are marching out. Now, the Metropolitan portrait has been associated with this gentleman right here. And I believe, in fact, that they're one and the same. In other words, the painting, the rediscovered Velasquez, is directly related to the famous painting of the Surrender of Breda. It is unusual for Velasquez to make preparatory studies of any kind for any of his pictures. He painted in a manner known as alla prima. I'll just give you a startling example. This is a religious scene also done for the Retiro during the same period. And here is how the X-radiograph looks. In other words, if I were just to show you the painting on the radiograph on the left, and say who's the artist, you say, where's the picture? And as a matter of fact, he's painting with very, very liquid colors, and he's painting directly on the canvas with no preliminary study. That's what he's by see small adjustments that are being made all of the time. But the Surrender of Breda is a rather different kind of commission. This on the left is the X-radiograph of the Surrender of Breda. It's a different kind of commission, and a kind of commission that Velasquez had never had to paint before, nor would he paint again. First of all, it's a very large picture. Second, it's a battle scene. And this is the kind of picture, as I say, this is the one and only example of a battle scene in Velasquez's work. So he, in a sense, had to prepare for this picture in ways that are not. Could you focus the slide on the right, please? He had to prepare for this picture in ways that he was really unaccustomed to do, and the proof of it is this drawing, which is in the Biblioteca Nacional in Madrid. But there are very, very few drawings by Velasquez, given his working method of painting directly from his mind to the canvas. There was no need, but he was obviously experimenting with the pose of Justin and Nassau. So this is, in fact, this drawing on the verso are the only known drawings that we have that are preparatory to the completion of a large painting. Similarly, the painting in the Metropolitan has to be understood, again, as unique, because we know of no other picture for which a preparatory oil study exists. This is the soldier here on the left, and this is the preparatory study of the man on the right. You'll notice it's very hard. Portrait identification is one of the bugaboos of historians of art, and in order to forge a useful tool for determining whether two painted portraits represent the same person, I formulated what I call the 5-second rule. And by the 5-second rule, I mean to say that if the resemblance is not immediately apparent, if you start to have to explain why two representations represent a single person, then they almost certainly do not. But in this case, it seems to me that the comparison, this painting satisfies at least my interpretation of the 5-second rule. And you'll notice in particular, he has a little bump on his nose, and here's the same bump on his nose just here. So, that's just one detail of many that could be pointed out. Why would he do this portrait of a given individual and then incorporate it into his finished painting? Well, I think that it has to do with the fact that Surrender of Breda, as I've showed you, contains a number of portraits of individuals. And I think what he wanted to do was not to make up the appearance of this soldier on the right. He wanted to use a live model so that it would appear to be alive. He could use almost anybody of a certain age, and that means that the identification as a sitter, in my opinion, will probably never be known. However, the connection of the newly attributed Met portrait to the figure here seems that it was just somebody, another person who worked in the palace and who Velasquez pulled over for a quick study, so to speak, one day and produced this really magnificent, lively, vibrant portrait. And the fact that it's done, and Michael Gallagher has eloquently displayed how it's done, shows us Velasquez's style, his execution, his means of expression in its purest form. This is Velasquez distilled, very high proof, drink indeed, and in this portrait we see, as we do in no other, how he brings to life an individual, gives him form, presence, and importance, although in fact the portrait is small, it is huge in conception and execution. Thank you.